Greth had not moved from the hospital bed in 6 days. That was the first thing the night staff told Nell Ford when she arrived for her first shift at Soccer Station Medical Wing. They said it like a warning. The big dragon in room 7 had not moved, had not eaten, had not let a single doctor or nurse get close enough to even check his temperature. He had arrived on a transport ship, unconscious and bleeding from 3 deep wounds across his side, and the moment he had woken up on the second day, every attempt at care had ended badly. The first doctor who had walked in had walked back out 30 seconds later with a scorch mark on his coat sleeve. The second had managed to get close enough to lift a medical scanner before Greth knocked it out of his hand and sent it crashing into the wall. The third had not even made it past the doorway before Greth turned his head and made a sound low in his chest that the doctor later described as the most frightening noise he had ever heard in 30 years of medicine. After that, Dr. Ann Boyle, the chief physician of the wing, had taped a handwritten sign to the door of room 7. It said, "Enter at your own risk." She had said it with a tired look on her face, the kind of look that meant she had already made her decision and was not interested in arguing about it. The staff had understood. Nobody went near room 7 anymore unless they absolutely had to, and even then they stood at the door, slid whatever was needed through the gap and left as fast as they could. The beds had been replaced twice. The first one had simply collapsed under Greth's weight when he shifted position on the third day. The second had fared worse. Nobody was entirely sure what had happened to it, but pieces of the frame had been found in 2 different corners of the room, and the maintenance team had gone very quiet when they came to clean it up. The meals that were delivered were always left outside the door on a tray. In the beginning, someone had tried leaving them just inside the room, sliding the tray across the floor carefully, but Greth had not touched any of them. The food sat there, went cold, and was eventually taken away untouched. The nutrition staff had filed 3 separate reports. The medical team had held 2 meetings. Nobody had come up with a solution that anyone was willing to actually try. This was the situation Nell Ford walked into on her first morning at Soccer Station. She was not a remarkable-looking person. She was small, with plain brown hair pulled back and the kind of tired eyes that came from too many early shifts and not enough sleep. She had transferred from a mid-size hospital on one of Earth's outer colonies, where she had spent 4 years working in a ward that dealt mostly with miners who had been in accidents and traders who had picked up infections from distant ports. She was used to difficult patients. She was used to people who did not want help, who were in too much pain to be polite, who snapped and pushed and said things they did not mean. She did not take it personally. That was something she had learned early. When the night nurse finished the handover report and got to room 7, she gave Nell the same look everyone seemed to give when they mentioned it, a sort of careful, sideways look, like they were trying to figure out how to say something without sounding afraid. "He's a Drakari warrior," the night nurse said. "Big one. Came in from the border conflict. His unit was, well, we don't know everything that happened. The transport crew wouldn't say much. His wounds are serious, but he won't let anyone near enough to treat them properly. Dr. Ann's official position is to wait until he either cooperates or loses consciousness again." Nell looked at the sign on the door. "Has anyone just tried sitting with him?" she asked. The night nurse blinked. "Sorry?" "Sitting with him," Nell said again. "Not treating. Not scanning. Just sitting." There was a pause. The night nurse looked at her the way people sometimes looked at someone who had said something that was either very smart or very foolish, and it was too early to know which. "No," the night nurse said finally. "Nobody has done that." Nell nodded slowly, looking at the door. Through it she could hear nothing. The room was completely silent. That kind of silence, she had learned, was not the same as peace. That was the silence of something that had gone very still because it had run out of other options. She went to the small staff kitchen at the end of the corridor, heated up the plainest thing she could find. A simple broth, nothing added, nothing special, the kind of thing they gave to patients who had not eaten in days and whose bodies needed something gentle, and put it in a bowl on a small tray. She also poured a cup of water. She stood there for a moment, looking at the tray, and then she picked it up and walked back down the corridor. She did not hesitate at the door. That was important. She had learned that hesitation was something patients noticed, and when they noticed it, it made everything harder. She pushed the door open with her shoulder and walked in. Room 7 was dim. The overhead lights had been turned down to their lowest setting at some point, either by Greth himself or by some staff member trying to keep him calm, and the only real light came from the soft blue glow of the monitoring equipment along one wall, most of which was reading nothing because no sensors had been successfully attached to the patient. The room smelled like antiseptic and something darker underneath it, like old smoke and dried blood. Greth was lying on the third bed they had brought in, a reinforced model that the maintenance team had quietly sourced from the cargo handler ward, designed for much heavier species. He was on his side, facing the wall, and he was enormous. Even lying down, he filled the bed completely and then some. His long tail curled at the end because there was simply no room for it to extend fully. His scales were a deep, dark gray, almost the color of storm clouds, and along his left side, the side facing up toward the ceiling, Nell could see the wounds clearly even from the doorway. 3 long gashes, running diagonally from just below his shoulder to his lower ribs. They had been partially cleaned at some point, probably when he was still unconscious, but they had not been properly treated. The edges were ragged and inflamed. It looked painful in a way that made Nell's chest tighten quietly. She walked across the room without making any sudden movements, set the tray down on the floor next to the bed. The table was gone, pushed into the far corner and half-tipped against the wall, and then she picked up the stool from beside the monitoring station, carried it over, and sat down. Greth had turned his head when she came in. She had felt it rather than seen it, that shift in attention, the way the air in the room changed when something very large decided to focus on you. He was watching her now with one eye. It was amber-colored, deep and still, and it was the eye of something that had been in a great deal of pain for a long time and had decided that the only thing left to do was endure. Nell looked back at him calmly. She did not reach for him. She did not lift a scanner or open a medical kit. She did not smile in the careful, professional way that she knew sometimes made difficult patients feel managed rather than seen. She just sat on the stool with her hands in her lap and met his eye and said in a plain and quiet voice, "You don't have to talk. I'll just sit here for a bit." Greth said nothing. He watched her for a long moment, that single amber eye unblinking, and Nell had the feeling of being read very carefully, measured in a way that went beyond what she looked like or how big she was. She stayed still and let him look. Then, slowly, he turned his head back toward the wall. Nell sat with him for 1 full hour. She did not speak again. She did not move to examine him. She listened to the quiet sound of his breathing, which was slow and heavy and carried in it the sound of something that had not rested properly in a long time. Outside the room, she could hear the ordinary sounds of the ward, footsteps in the corridor, the soft beep of monitors, voices far away. In here, it was just the two of them and the blue glow of the equipment and the silence between them, which was not comfortable exactly but was no longer hostile. When the hour was up, Nell stood, picked up the stool and carried it back to its place by the wall. She looked at the tray on the floor. The bowl of broth was empty. The cup of water was empty. She picked up the tray, walked to the door and left without saying a word. Nell came back the next morning. She had thought about it on the walk home the night before, turning it over in her mind the way she sometimes did with patients who stayed with her after a shift ended. Most of the time after a long day she was good at leaving work behind. She had learned that skill out of necessity. But Greth had stayed with her, not in a troubling way, just in the way that something unfinished tends to sit quietly at the back of your mind until you return to it. She had not told anyone about the empty bowl. She was not sure why exactly. It felt like something private, like something that belonged to the room and to the silence in it, and saying it out loud in the bright, busy corridor would have changed what it was. So she had signed out at the end of her shift, walked past the night staff doing their handover, and said nothing about room 7 except that the patient had been quiet. Which was true. He had been very quiet. In the morning she went to the kitchen first, the same as before. She heated the same plain broth, poured the same cup of water and put them on the same small tray. One of the kitchen staff, a round-faced man named Pete who had worked the early shift for longer than anyone could remember, watched her do it without comment. Then, as she was picking up the tray, he reached past her and added a second cup, this one filled with something darker, warmer, that smelled faintly of something herbal and rich. "Drackery, drink this," Pete said simply, not looking at her. "We started stocking it when they opened the border routes. Hot, strong. They like it in the morning." He paused. Nobody's ever actually given any to him. Figured it was pointless, the state he was in. Nell looked at the second cup. "Thank you, Pete," she said. He shrugged and went back to his work. She walked down the corridor with the tray and stopped outside room 7. The sign was still there. She read it once, the same as yesterday, and then she pushed the door open with her shoulder and went in. The room looked exactly the same as she had left it. The dim light, the blue glow of the monitors, the overturned table still pushed against the far wall. Greth was in the same position too, on his side facing the wall, his great gray form filling the reinforced bed completely. But something shifted the moment she stepped through the door. She felt it again, that change in the quality of the silence. He had heard her come in. She was certain of it. He had heard her and recognized, in whatever way a creature like him recognized things, that it was the same person as yesterday. He did not turn his head this time. Nell crossed the room, set the tray on the floor beside the bed and went to get the stool. She carried it back to the same spot she had sat yesterday and settled onto it with the same calm she had carried in with her. She put her hands in her lap. She looked at the side of Greth's head, at the long ridge of dark scales along his jaw, at the way his breathing moved his whole body slowly up and down. The wounds on his side looked the same. Maybe very slightly worse at the edges. She noted it and said nothing. For a long time neither of them spoke. The ward sounds filtered in faintly from outside, a door closing somewhere, a distant intercom announcement, the soft rhythmic beep of equipment down the hall. In here it was still and quiet and the blue light made everything look underwater. After perhaps 20 minutes, Greth spoke. He did not turn to face her. His voice was low and rough, like something that had not been used in several days, which it probably had not. He said, in the common trade language that most species on the station used, "You came back." It was not a question. It was an observation, stated plainly, in the tone of someone noting a fact that they had not expected and were not yet sure what to do with. Nell said, "Yes." Another long silence. "Why?" Greth said. Still not a question. More like a word he had let out without meaning to, that had escaped before he could decide whether he wanted to say it. Nell considered her answer. She did not rush it. She had learned that rushing answers to patients who finally started talking was one of the fastest ways to make them stop. "Same reason as yesterday," she said. "You seemed like you could use someone nearby. Not doing anything. Just nearby." Greth said nothing to that. But his breathing changed slightly. It was subtle, a small, slow release of air, not quite a sigh, that came from somewhere deep in his chest and made his whole body settle a fraction lower into the bed. Nell noticed it and filed it away quietly. She looked at the tray on the floor. The broth and the water were sitting there untouched. The second cup, Pete's edition, was steaming gently in the cool air of the room. She reached down, picked it up carefully and set it a little closer to the edge of the bed, within reach if he chose to extend his arm. "Pete in the kitchen made that," she said. "He said it's something Drackery drink in the mornings. I don't know if he made it right. I've never tasted it." Greth turned his head then. Not all the way, just enough to look at the cup with one eye. He stared at it for a moment with an expression Nell could not read, because she did not yet know his face well enough to read it. Then he looked at her. She met his eye the same way she had yesterday. Calm, steady, not performing anything. He looked back at the cup. Very slowly, with the careful movement of something that was in considerable pain and was not going to show it any more than it had to, he reached out one large hand and picked it up. His hands were scaled across the back and on the knuckles, but the inner part of the palm was softer, darker in color. Nell noticed that his hands were shaking very slightly. Not from fear. From exhaustion, she thought. Or from the effort of keeping everything held in for too long. He lifted the cup and drank. She watched his face as he did. Something moved across it briefly, something that was not quite an expression but was the shadow of one. Like a door opening an inch and then closing again. He set the cup down on the edge of the bed frame and did not say anything for a while. Then he said, "It is not the same as home." "No," Nell agreed. "I don't imagine it is." "It is close," he said. And there was something in those two words that was so quietly painful that Nell felt it land in her chest like a stone dropped into still water. She did not say anything in response to that. She just nodded once, slowly, and let it be what it was. They sat in silence after that for a long time. Not the tense silence of the first day, when every moment had felt like standing at the edge of something that might break badly. This was different. It was still and a little heavy the way air feels before rain, but it was not hostile. Greth had turned his head back toward the wall, but there was something in the set of his shoulders that was different from yesterday. Something that had lowered by a small degree. Nell sat with him for the full hour. She did not push. She did not try to examine his wounds or steer the conversation anywhere purposeful. When he spoke again, once briefly about halfway through, it was only to ask what her name was. She told him. He repeated it once, quietly as if testing the shape of it, and then did not say anything else. When the hour was up, she stood and picked up the stool. She looked at the tray. The Drackery drink was gone. The broth was gone. The water was gone. Every cup and bowl on the tray was empty, cleaned out completely, and the tray had been nudged slightly, just an inch, from where she had set it, as though at some point he had reached down and drawn it a little closer. Nell picked up the tray and walked to the door. "Same time tomorrow," she said, not as a question. Behind her, Greth said nothing. But he did not say no. She walked out into the bright corridor and stood still for just a moment, holding the empty tray, and felt something quiet and careful beginning, the way certain things begin, Not with a sound but with a shift, small and certain like the first change in the air that tells you the season is turning. The third visit was like the second. Nell came in the morning with the tray. Pete had the Dracarys drink ready without her asking, already set beside the broth and water when she arrived at the kitchen. He did not say anything about it. He just put it there and turned back to his work, and Nell picked up the tray and walked down the corridor. Greth was awake when she came in. She could tell because the quality of his stillness was different when he was awake. More deliberate, like something choosing not to move rather than something simply resting. She set the tray down, got the stool and sat. He did not turn to look at her, but within a few minutes his hand came down and took the Dracarys drink from the tray, and that was enough. They sat for an hour. He spoke once, a single short sentence asking if the station ever had real weather or if it was always the same recycled air. Nell told him about the climate systems, how they tried to cycle through different pressures and humidity levels to keep various species comfortable, how it never really felt like actual weather but was meant to be a small comfort. Greth made a low sound that she was beginning to understand was not displeasure but simply acknowledgement. Then he was quiet again until she left. The tray was empty when she picked it up. She said, "Same time tomorrow," and walked out. The fourth visit began the same way as all the others. Tray, stool, silence. The room the same dim blue, the wounds on his side the same angry red at the edges that made her chest tighten every time she looked at them. She had started noting in her personal records, not the official charts since she had no official access to his case, but her own small notebook, how the wounds looked each day. Not improving. Not dramatically worse. Sitting in that difficult middle place where an injury goes when it is not being treated properly and the body is too exhausted to fight it alone. She sat down and put her hands in her lap and looked at the far wall the way she sometimes did when she wanted to give him the sense of space, of not being watched. For the first 15 minutes, everything was the same as before. Then Greth said, "How many patients have you lost?" Nell turned to look at him. He was still facing the wall, but his voice had been different this time. Not the flat, careful tone of someone making small conversation. Something underneath it. Something that had been sitting in him for a while, pressing up against the inside of his ribs, waiting for a moment to come out. "Some," Nell said honestly. "Not many. But some." "Do you remember them?" he said. "Yes," she said. "All of them." Greth was quiet for a moment. His hand was resting on the edge of the bed, and she could see the tendons in it shift slightly, like something tightening and releasing. "We had 7, he said. "In my unit. 7 including me." Nell said nothing. She had learned by now that the most important thing in these moments was to not fill the silence. To leave it open and wide like a door held back so that whatever was trying to come through had enough room. "Their names were Darrow," Greth said. "Skell, Von, Orth, Pick, and Hor." He said each name with the same weight, slow and separate like setting down stones one at a time. "We had been a unit for 11 years. Since training. We had served on 4 border stations and 2 active conflict zones and 1 evacuation mission that nobody was supposed to know about." Pause. "We knew each other the way you know your own hands." Nell stayed very still. "The attack came before dawn," Greth said. "On the 14th day of a patrol cycle. We were in a standard holding position. There was no warning in the readings. Nothing that said what was coming." His voice was level. Completely level, in the way that a voice becomes when a person has gone over the same events so many times in their own mind that the words have worn smooth. "It was over in less than 4 minutes. I know because I counted afterward. I counted every second from the first hit to the last sound." He stopped. Nell waited. "I was at the rear of the formation," he said. "That is the only reason. Not skill. Not strength. Not anything I did. I was at the rear and the attack came from the front, and by the time it reached where I was standing, it had already taken everything else." He paused again. "I was not even injured in the attack itself. These wounds," he meant the 3 gashes along his side, "came from the wreckage. From pulling myself out of what was left of our position. Not from fighting. From crawling." The word crawling sat in the room like something heavy. "I carried what I could back to the transport line," he said. "The identifications. The unit markers. The things you bring back so that families know. And then I was put on a ship and brought here and people in white kept trying to come into my room and I—" He stopped. His hand on the bed frame had tightened completely now, the knuckles pale against the dark scales. "I did not want to be touched," he said quietly. "I did not want to be repaired. There did not seem to be a reason for it." Nell felt those last words land somewhere deep and careful inside her. She did not look away from him. She kept her eyes on his face, on the long hard line of his jaw, the deep-set amber eye that was still fixed on the wall, and she breathed slowly and let him know by the quality of her stillness that she had heard every word and was not going to flinch from any of it. "Among my people," Greth said, "a warrior who survives when his unit does not is called Sorenval." He said the word in his own language, low and deliberate. It does not translate well. The closest meaning in your language is, one who remained. But that is not quite it. Carries more weight than that. It means one who should ask himself why he remained, and whether the answer is enough. Nell let that sit for a moment before she spoke. "Do your people believe there is always an answer?" she asked carefully. Greth was quiet for a long time. "Some do," he said. "Some say that the one who remains was kept for a purpose. That survival is a debt to be paid through future action." Pause. "Others say that Sorenval is simply what it sounds like. A mark. Something that does not wash off." "What do you believe?" Nell asked. He did not answer that. Not directly. Instead he said, "Darrow had a hatchling. 8 months old. He showed me a picture on the last morning before the patrol. He was..." Greth stopped. Something moved in his throat. He was very proud. The hatchling had just learned to extend its wings for the first time. He said the wings were already bigger than expected for the age. He said that with great seriousness, like it was important military information. Another pause, and when Greth spoke again his voice had dropped so low it was almost below hearing. "It was the last thing he ever said to me. About the size of his hatchling's wings." The room was completely silent. Nell did not say that she was sorry. She had learned long ago that sorry, said too quickly, could feel like a door closing, like the other person was trying to move past the pain rather than standing in it with you. Instead she stayed exactly where she was, on the stool beside his bed, close enough that he could feel another living presence in the room, and she said nothing at all for a long while. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet and even. "Darrow," she said. "Skell. Von. Orth. Pick. And Hor." She said each name the same way he had. Slow. Separate. With weight. Greth went very still. "I will remember them," Nell said simply. "I didn't know them. But I'll remember their names now. That's something I think. That their names are in another person's mind, somewhere far from home." For a long moment, nothing moved in the room at all. Then, so quietly that Nell almost did not see it, Greth turned his head. Not fully. Just enough that she could see both his eyes for the first time since she had started coming to this room. They were the same deep amber, both of them, and they were bright in a way that had nothing to do with the blue light of the monitors. He did not speak. He looked at her for a long moment, and then he turned back to the wall, and his breathing was slower and deeper than she had ever heard it, like something that had been held underwater for a very long time and had finally, carefully, been allowed to surface. Nell sat with him until the hour was done. When she picked up the tray and walked to the door, she did not say same time tomorrow. She already knew she did not need to. Nell did not sleep well that night. Not because anything had gone wrong. Nothing had gone wrong. In fact, something had gone quietly and carefully right in the way that certain things do, not with a loud moment or a clear turning point, but with something small and steady that you only fully understood when you lay in the dark afterward and let it settle. She kept thinking about the way Greth had turned his head. Just that inch. Just enough to show both eyes. She kept thinking about the names he had said, and the way he had said them, like stones being set down one at a time in a careful line. She kept thinking about Darrow and the hatchling's wings and the way a person, any person of any species on any world, could spend their last morning alive talking about something so small and so full of love, without knowing it was the last morning. She stared at the ceiling of her small quarters for a long time. Then she got up, made herself a cup of tea, sat by the narrow window that looked out over the station's inner dock, and watched the slow movement of ships in the dark until it was time to go in. She arrived at the ward earlier than usual. Pete had the tray ready. The Drackery drink was there, the broth, the water. Pete had also added, without comment, a small portion of something solid, a dense, dark-colored block that Nell did not recognize. "Protein ration," Pete said before she could ask. "Drackery form. High density." He should have been eating these from day one with his injuries. Body can't repair that kind of damage on broth alone. He kept his eyes on his work. Figured it was time. Nell looked at the solid block on the tray. It was small, but it had the look of something serious, something meant for a body that needed to rebuild. "Thank you, Pete," she said. "Just don't tell doctor, and I've been running a separate nutrition program for a patient who isn't officially receiving treatment," he said mildly. Nell picked up the tray and walked down the corridor. Outside room 7 she stopped, but not because of the sign. She stopped because she had decided, on the walk over this morning, that today was going to be different. She had a small medical kit tucked under her arm alongside the tray, basic supplies, nothing complicated, the kind of kit she could have assembled in her sleep. Clean dressings, antiseptic solution, a soft applicator, a tube of the broad-spectrum healing compound that worked across most known species. She had not asked permission to bring it. She had not discussed it with Dr. N or anyone else on the medical team. She had simply picked it up from the supply room and carried it with her, and if Greth told her to put it away, she would put it away without argument. But she had a feeling, quiet and certain, that today he would not tell her to put it away. She pushed the door open and went in. Greth was awake. He was lying on his back today, which was different, the first time she had seen him in any position other than facing the wall. His eyes were open and fixed on the ceiling, and he turned them toward her when she came in without moving the rest of his body. He looked exhausted in a very deep way, the kind of exhaustion that a full night of sleep could not fix because it had been building for much longer than one night. Nell set the tray on the floor, added the medical kit beside it and went to get the stool. When she sat down, Greth's eyes moved to the medical kit. He looked at it for a moment. Then he looked at her. She met his eyes and said, simply and without making a performance of it, "Your wounds need to be cleaned and dressed properly. They've been sitting untreated for too long and the edges are inflamed. It will take about 30 minutes. It will be uncomfortable, but I will go slowly and I will tell you everything I'm doing before I do it." She paused. "If you want me to stop at any point, say so and I'll stop immediately. No questions." Greth looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked back at the ceiling. "All right," he said. Nell exhaled slowly through her nose and reached for the medical kit. She started with the antiseptic solution, which she applied with a soft cloth in slow, careful strokes, working from the outer edge of each wound inward. She had treated bad wounds before. Mining accidents that left deep lacerations, burns from equipment failures, injuries that had been ignored too long because the person involved had been too busy or too stubborn or too frightened to deal with them. She knew how to move her hands with patience. She knew how to make the work feel less like an intrusion and more like something being gently undone. Greth's jaw tightened the first time the cloth made contact with the inflamed skin at the wound's edge. She felt the tension move through him like a current, the whole large body going briefly rigid, and she slowed her hands even further and said, in the same quiet voice she used when she sat beside him, "Still with me?" "Yes," he said through his teeth. "Good," she said. "I'm going to keep going. Same pace." And she did. She talked while she worked. Not about the wounds, not about medicine, not about anything that required him to engage or respond. She talked the way she sometimes talked to patients who were in pain and needed something to follow with their minds other than the pain itself. Something light and distant and real, like a thread leading somewhere else. She talked about rain. She told him that where she had grown up, on a small coastal settlement on Earth's northern edge, it rained for nearly half the year. Not dramatic rain, not storms, just a steady, quiet gray rain that came in off the sea and settled over everything like a soft cloth. She told him that as a child she had not minded it at all. She told him that she used to sit on the front step of her grandmother's house with a cup of something warm and just listen to it hitting the leaves of the garden outside, and that there was a particular sound it made on the broad flat leaves of the plants her grandmother grew along the fence that she had never heard anywhere else in her life and sometimes still missed in a way that surprised her. Greth said nothing, but she felt the tension in him shift. Not disappear. The pain was real and the treatment was uncomfortable and she was not going to pretend otherwise, but change in quality. Become something he was holding differently. She moved to the second wound and kept talking. She told him about her grandmother's garden. It was not a grand garden, she said, just a narrow strip along the side of a small house, crammed with more plants than the space really had room for. Herbs and vegetables mixed in with flowers because her grandmother had never seen the point of keeping them separate. Tomatoes growing next to roses. Beans climbing the same frame as something purple and sweet-smelling that Nell had never known the name of. Her grandmother had known the name of everything in that garden and had told Nell many times, and Nell had forgotten most of them, and she had never stopped regretting that. She applied the healing compound along the length of the first wound, spreading it in smooth, careful strokes. Under her hands she could feel the heat of the inflammation beginning to ease the slightest amount as the compound made contact, and she thought that Greth could probably feel it too because some of the rigidity in his side softened. She talked about bread. She said that her grandmother baked bread every Sunday morning without exception, and that the smell of it was the first thing Nell could remember from early childhood. Not a sight or a sound but a smell, warm and yeasty and completely safe feeling, the smell of somewhere that nothing bad was going to happen. She said that she had tried many times to bake bread herself and had never managed to get it right, not the way her grandmother did, and she suspected it was one of those things that lived in the hands rather than in any recipe. She was applying the last dressing, smoothing the edges down carefully, when she became aware of a presence in the doorway. She did not stop working. She kept her hands moving at the same pace, kept her voice at the same level, and glanced sideways just enough to see Dr. Boyle standing at the open door of room 7 with a tablet under her arm and an expression on her face that was very still and very unreadable. Dr. looked at Nell's hands on the wound. She looked at the medical kit open on the floor. She looked at Greth, lying on his back on the reinforced bed, not rigid, not hostile, his eyes on the ceiling with something in them that was not peace exactly but was the closest thing to it that Nell had seen there. Dr. stood in the doorway for a long moment. Then she turned and walked away without saying a word. Nell smoothed down the last edge of the final dressing and sat back on the stool. "Done?" she said quietly. Greth was silent for a moment. Then he said in a low voice, "The bread. Did it smell the same every time?" Nell looked at him. "Every single time," she said. "Exactly the same." Greth closed his eyes. Later that morning, Dr. sat at her desk, opened Greth's file on her screen, found the sedation order she had prepared 4 days ago, and deleted it without filing it. She sat for a moment looking at the empty space where it had been. Then she closed the file and moved on to the next one. The confirmation came on a Tuesday. Dr. herself brought the scan results, which surprised everyone on the ward who happened to notice, because Dr. had not personally entered room 7 since the sign had gone up. She came in the morning, while Nell was already there on her stool with the empty tray on the floor beside her, and she stood just inside the doorway with her tablet and read the results in her precise, unhurried way. The wounds were closing. The inflammation had dropped significantly. The tissue underneath was rebuilding at a rate that was, she said, honestly better than she had expected given the days of no treatment at the start. His internal readings, taken from sensors that Nell had quietly and carefully attached over the past 3 mornings, one at a time without any fuss, showed that his body was no longer under the kind of stress that had been worrying her. His nutrition levels had improved. His rest patterns had stabilized. Dr. looked up from her tablet when she finished reading. She looked at Greth, who was sitting partially upright for the first time, his back against the raised head of the bed, which was also new. She looked at Nell on the stool. She looked at the empty cups on the tray. She said, "Good progress," in the tone of someone who meant considerably more than those 2 words but was choosing to keep it simple. Then she walked out. Nell looked at the doorway for a moment after she left. Then she looked at Greth. He was looking at her already. It still caught her slightly off guard even now, after many mornings in this room, the full weight of his attention when he chose to give it. His amber eyes were clear today in a way they had not been on the first morning, when they had been dull and flat with pain and exhaustion. There was something alert in them now. Something that had come back from wherever it had retreated to. She said good progress. She did, Nell agreed. Her voice suggested she found this surprising. "I think she found it very surprising," Nell said honestly. Greth was quiet for a moment, looking at the middle distance. Then he said without shifting his gaze, "You were not surprised." It was not a question but Nell answered it anyway. "No," she said. "I wasn't." He looked at her then. Directly, fully, with that steady amber gaze that she had grown used to but which still carried weight. He was quiet for a moment in the particular way she had come to recognize, not the silence of having nothing to say, but the silence of choosing carefully which thing to say first. "I want to ask you something," he said. "All right," Nell said. He did not rush it. He looked at her for a moment longer, and then he looked down at his own hands, resting on the blanket across his lap. Large hands, scarred at the knuckles, the scales across the back catching the blue light of the monitors. He turned them over once, slowly looking at the inner palms and then set them back down. "When you came into this room on the first morning," he said, "you had been told what I was. What I had done to the others who came in. The bed frames. The equipment." He paused. "You knew all of that?" "Yes," Nell said. "And you came in anyway," he said. "With a bowl of broth and a stool." He said it plainly, not with wonder exactly but with something close to it, the tone of someone describing an event that they had been turning over in their mind and still had not fully explained to themselves. "Why did you not fear me?" The room was quiet. Nell did not answer immediately. She took the question seriously, the way it deserved to be taken, and she thought about it honestly, not reaching for the answer that sounded best, but for the one that was actually true. "I did," she said. "A little. First morning when I pushed the door open. Yes, there was fear. You're very large and I'd heard what happened to the equipment and I'm not someone who pretends things don't affect them. Greth watched her. But, she said, and she paused again, finding the right words, you looked like someone who was hurting. And that was louder than everything else. She met his eyes steadily. When I came through that door and saw you lying there facing the wall, not eating, not letting anyone near, I didn't see something dangerous. I saw something in pain that had run out of ways to say so. And that's something I know how to be near. That's something I've always known how to be near. She paused. The fear was real, but it was quieter than what I was seeing. So I followed what was louder. Greth held her gaze for a long moment. He did not respond immediately. He looked at her with an expression she was only now, after all these mornings, beginning to be able to read. It was not a simple expression. It had several things in it at once. Something that was almost recognition, and something older and heavier beneath that, and something else that she did not yet have a name for. Among my people, he said slowly, there is a word. Velsorith. He said it carefully, the sounds of it different in his own language, fuller somehow, like the word was larger than its length suggested. It does not have a simple translation. The closest your language comes is, one who hears beneath the noise. He stopped. It describes a quality, a way of perceiving. The ability to hear what a living thing is actually experiencing underneath what it is showing to the world. He paused again. Among Dracari it is not common. It is considered rare. And those who carry it are regarded with a specific kind of respect, because they cannot be deceived by performance. They hear the real thing. Nell was quiet, listening. Unit commanders look for it in their warriors, Greth said. Healers who carry it are considered the most valuable members of any medical line. There are records in our oldest histories of Velsorith individuals who ended conflicts simply by being present in negotiations, because every person in the room knew that this one could hear the truth underneath whatever was being said. He looked at her steadily. It is not something that can be learned. Among my people, it is believed that you either carry it or you do not. And most do not. Nell looked at him. She felt something quiet and warm move through her, though she kept her face still. I'm just a nurse, she said. You came into a room that 7 trained medical officers had walked away from, Greth said. You sat on a stool with empty hands and you did not perform calm. You were calm, which is entirely different. You knew I was in pain before I told you. You knew I was not dangerous in the way they thought I was. You heard what I was actually experiencing and you responded to that and not to what I was showing. He paused. That is Velsorith. It does not matter what your profession is called. Nell looked down at her hands in her lap for a moment. Your grandmother, Greth said then, unexpectedly. She looked up. The one with the garden, he said. And the bread. There was something careful in his voice. Did she carry it also? Nell thought about her grandmother, the small round woman with the soil-dark hands and the unhurried way of moving through a room, who had a habit of sitting with people without needing to fill every silence, who always seemed to know before you said anything that something was wrong, who never pushed but was simply there in a way that made you feel like whatever you were carrying had somewhere to be set down. Yes, Nell said quietly. I think she did. Greth nodded slowly. It moves through families sometimes, he said. That is what our histories say. Not always. But sometimes. They sat in the still blue light of the room for a while after that, not speaking, in the comfortable silence that had built itself between them over many mornings without either of them planning it. After a time Greth said in a different tone, quieter, more personal, I would not have let any of them help me. Nell understood that he meant the other doctors. The other nurses. The ones before her. I know, she said. It was not because I did not need help, he said. It was because, he stopped. He looked at his hands again. I did not want to be repaired by someone who only saw the wounds on the outside. Nell looked at him for a moment. I know, she said again more softly. Greth looked at her. Then, for the first time since she had begun coming to room 7 every morning, something shifted in his face. Something moved past all the weight and the hardness and the long exhaustion and became, just briefly, something much simpler. Not quite a smile. His face was not built for what she would have called a smile. But the closest thing to one that his features could make. It was enough. Nell picked up the empty tray and stood up from the stool. She thought about Velsorith on the walk back down the corridor, turning the word over in her mind, feeling the shape of it. She thought about her grandmother's garden in the rain. She thought she understood now where it had come from. The clearance came on a Friday morning. Doctor and delivered it the same way she had delivered the scan results. Personally, quietly, without ceremony. She came into room 7 while Nell was there, stood just inside the doorway and read from her tablet in her precise voice. The wounds had closed cleanly. The tissue had rebuilt well. The internal readings had been stable for 4 consecutive days. There was no medical reason to keep him any longer, and every medical reason to let him move and breathe real air and begin the slower work of putting himself back together in the way that only living your life could do. She looked up from the tablet when she finished. Greth was sitting fully upright, both feet on the floor for the first time, his great frame filling the space beside the reinforced bed in a way that made the room feel smaller than it had when he was lying down. He looked different than he had on the day Nell had first walked in. The wounds were gone beneath clean dressings that would dissolve on their own within the week. His eyes were clear and sharp. He held himself with a straightness that had not been there before, not the rigid, defensive stillness of the early days, but something settled and deliberate, like a structure that had been repaired properly and knew its own strength again. Doctor and looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at Nell. She said, "Good work," in the same tone she had used for good progress, 2 words carrying considerably more weight than they showed on the surface. Then she walked out and left them to it. Nell looked at Greth. He was looking at the door that Doctor and had just walked through, and there was something thoughtful in his expression. "She is not an easy person," he said. "No," Nell agreed. "But she is a good one," he said. "Yes," Nell said. "She is." Greth nodded slowly as if confirming something he had already suspected. Then he looked at Nell, and the room was quiet for a moment in the way it had been quiet so many mornings. Full rather than empty, the silence of 2 people who had run out of the need to fill every space with words. "Today," he said. "Today," she confirmed. He stood up. It was the first time she had seen him fully standing, and it was something. He was tall enough that he had to angle his head slightly to avoid the overhead light fixture, and the breadth of his shoulders filled her peripheral vision on both sides when she was looking directly at him. But what struck her was not the size. What struck her was the way he moved, carefully, deliberately, with the kind of attention to each movement that came from someone who had spent days learning to trust their body again and was not yet ready to take it for granted. He reached down and picked up the small bundle of items from the bedside, the unit markers, the identifications, the things he had carried back from the border. He had kept them beside him every night. Nell had never touched them and never asked about them. He wrapped them in the cloth they lived in and held them against his side, and she saw his hand press against them for just a moment before he released the pressure. She looked away, giving him that. The word had gone around the station the way words always did, quietly and faster than anyone officially intended. By the time Nell and Greth walked out of room 7 and down the corridor toward the main departure bay, there were people gathered. Not a crowd exactly, but enough. Station officials in their formal gray jackets. 2 military liaisons who had arrived the previous afternoon with paperwork and respectful expressions. A handful of medical staff from other wards who had heard the story in the way that everyone on the station had heard some version of it by now. The dragon in room 7, the human nurse, the empty bowls. Pete from the kitchen was there too, standing at the back near the wall with his arms folded, wearing his work apron because he had come directly from the early shift and had not stopped to take it off. The corridor felt formal in the way that corridors did when people stood in them with straight backs and quiet faces, waiting for something that mattered. Greth walked through it steadily. The officials stepped forward first. The senior station commander, a tall gray-haired man named Call, offered a formal nod and spoke briefly about service and recovery and the station's honor at having provided care. He had a good voice for formal speeches, measured and warm, and he meant what he said. Greth received it with a straight back and a nod of acknowledgement. The military liaisons presented their paperwork and said what they were required to say about the border conflict in Greth's unit and the formal record. Greth signed what needed signing with the careful, deliberate strokes of someone who understood the weight of official documents. He handed the papers back without expression. A junior officer stepped forward to say something and then seemed to lose his nerve slightly under Greth's direct gaze and said it anyway, stumbling a little over the words, about how the whole station had been, well, aware of the situation and they were glad he was well. Greth looked at him for a moment and then said quietly that he appreciated the honesty of stumbling over words rather than delivering them too smoothly, and the junior officer blinked and then stood slightly straighter. Greth walked on. He walked past the medical staff, who stood in a row with the careful, professional expressions of people who had not been in room 7 but understood something about what had happened there. He walked past the station officials who had run out of formal things to say and were now simply standing respectfully. He walked past the small cluster of curious faces from other departments who had come because they wanted to see, and there was nothing wrong with that. He walked past all of them. And then he stopped. He stopped in front of Nell Ford, who was standing to the side of the corridor the way she tended to stand in group situations. Not hiding exactly but not in the center of things either, giving space to whatever was happening without removing herself from it. She was in her regular uniform, her plain brown hair pulled back the same way it always was, her hands at her sides. She had told herself that morning that she was not going to make this difficult. She had told herself it was a good ending, the best kind, the kind where the patient walked out healthy and whole, and that she should be glad and straightforward about it and not make a fuss. She was finding that moderately difficult to hold on to. Greth stood in front of her and looked at her for a moment with those clear amber eyes, and the corridor was very quiet. Everyone in it had gone still in the way that people go still when they understand that what they are watching is not for them but that they are privileged to see it anyway. Then Greth lowered his head. He brought it down slowly and with great deliberateness, all the way down until his head was level with hers, that great, scarred, gray-scaled head that had once made 7 trained medical professionals walk back out of a room, coming down until his eyes were at the same height as her eyes, and he held it there. His neck was curved, his whole large frame bent forward in a posture that was nothing like defeat and everything like intention. It was the posture of a mountain choosing to come to eye level with something small and deciding that small was not the right word at all. Nell had not known, until Pete had quietly explained it to her 2 days ago after she had mentioned wondering what Dracary farewell customs looked like, that this gesture existed. Pete had looked it up, the way Pete looked things up when he thought the information might matter to someone he liked. He had told her, in his plain unhurried way, that among the Dracary, lowering the head fully to another's level was the deepest physical gesture of respect in their culture. That it was given only to commanders after great battles. To elders who had carried a community through loss. To those who had done something that could not be repaid and for which the only honest response was this: to make yourself equal before them, to say with your body what words could not reach. She understood now, standing in the corridor with his eyes level with hers, that he had known she would know what it meant. Nell raised her right hand and placed it gently against the side of his jaw. The scales there were smooth and cool under her palm, and she felt the slight movement of his breath against her hand, slow and steady and strong. She thought about a rainy coast. A garden full of mixed-up flowers and vegetables. The smell of bread on a Sunday morning. Her grandmother's unhurried hands. She thought about Velsorith and the things that move through families sometimes. She nodded once. Greth held still for one more moment, his eyes on hers, and in them she saw everything that the past days had held. The pain, the names said like stones being set down, the empty bowls, the slow and careful rebuilding, and then she saw him let it settle into whatever place inside him it was going to live from now on. He straightened. He turned toward the departure bay doors without looking back because people like Greth did not look back at doorways, and the doors opened for him and he walked through them and out into the wide dark between the stars. The corridor was silent for a moment after he was gone. Then Pete, from his spot at the back wall, unfolded his arms and said to no one in particular in his plain and simple way, "Right then," and walked back toward the kitchen to start the next shift. Nell stood where she was for just a moment longer. She pressed her right hand briefly against her own side, feeling the ghost of the cool scales still sitting in her palm, and then she let it go. She turned around and walked back to the ward. There was a full day's work waiting, and she had never been someone who made people wait.